Okay, this lesson is about peripherals and storage devices and using devices used for communication. Two different groups. There are special notes for you to take about USB. Be careful about the use of the word, the phrase USB. Here's an example of what someone's done with an old storage device. This used to take little plastic sleeves that contained a magnetic disc, and he's repurposed it for this use. Okay, so that was what someone's used them for now. Okay, storage devices. There are two broad categories of the storage device: primary storage and secondary storage. Primary storage is what the computer wants to use immediately and is where it expects to find information that it's going to use right now. That's normally in most computers going to be either a magnetic hard disk or a solid state hard disk. There are some sorts of computers where a server room will use completely separate setups where they use something called network attached storage, but essentially it's still, at some point, it's using magnetic and solid storages. Secondary storage that you're seeing here is normally used for making some form of backup or information that you don't readily need. So a backup is taking a snapshot of your files and saying this is what it currently looks like, and then being able to come back to it if something's gone wrong. Regular backups is still a good idea. Or it could be you've got information you want to transfer. Most of you will recognise transferring media in there. Things like CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray, flash drives. They're the common ones used now, and smart drives. But other things can be used as well for these movable. You can actually make movable hard disks as well. So that's so you can transfer information. You might want to just have another store that contains the big collection of data that you don't want right in the main computer filling up space, so you put it onto another piece of storage that isn't accessed all the time and can often be put into idle mode. So you might have a fairly slow but very big storage available on your computer, and that would be a secondary storage. The primary one would be working quickly. The other sorts of purposes of these devices is to allow you to secure your information, the backup idea. So the classes we've got within this is you've got the magnetic disks, things like these floppy disks. They have magnetic particles on a plastic or a glass disk, and as a head reads over it, it changes the direction the magnets point. An optical drive or disk like CD, DVD, Blu-ray, where the information affects how a laser light passes through or reflects off a surface. Solid state drives, this is where everything's stored inside silicon, and really there's no moving parts, which makes them good for a lot of they make them good for portable uses, and they can normally be quite small now. And then we've got this cloud NAS. Cloud is storing something on the internet. Network attached storages, NAS, they're more personal local ones. These at some point will use one of these technologies to store the information as well. So they are a backup, but in themselves they are a service that still uses. Their computer will have to communicate and store with this on a hard disk of some form. Right, with storage, quite a history of storage. These are floppy disks. They contain that plastic sleeve inside, and this one has a plastic disc as well. It spins round, a head reads it. 1970s, this 8-inch disc would hold about 100 kilobytes, and that was right at the end when they were finishing off. In 1980s, we'd got up to a 5.25-inch disc, which was a lot more usable and friendly, and they could store up to 200 kilobytes, 100 kilobytes both sides. Then we got up to, after that, 3.5-inch discs were introduced, initially about 320 kilobytes. But by the 1990s, they were storing 1.4 megabytes, which is 100 times as big as this 8-inch storage. They could store that much information. Interestingly, this picture would not fit on this first disk. This picture is 120 kilobytes, so that would not even be stored on that disk anymore. We also had certain floppy disks that were made by particular manufacturers for their own hardware that could store quite a lot more magnetic disks. There is another thing called magnetic tape, where a long loop of tape goes past a read-write head, which has one advantage, that the length of the tape can be adjusted so that you can change the capacities. Downside is that they are often a lot slower because the tape has to move, and the tape can actually stretch and break. So magnetic tape has its problems. Hard disks, these are glass hard disks, magnetic ones, and going back to the 1960s, you've got disks like this in the back where that would store about 5 megabytes. It's only 5 of these disks, these little blue disks. This sort of disk was used in schools for storing all their information for the computer network, for their programming, and in the mid-1980s these things were 10-20 megabytes. That's still only 10 or 20 of these disks coming along later. And then gradually, as we come along, fairly common hard disk around the 1990s was in the range of 500 megabytes to a gigabyte. Very quickly after that, you started to have to use multiple gigabyte hard disks, to the point where nowadays a disk like this, it's quite possible to get 4 terabytes of disk on them. Notice all these disks here, they've had a covering removed. They are normally kept in a very clean environment and often low pressure. There's a bit of a vacuum inside so that the air resistance is reduced and it can work a lot quicker. But where's the USB? Well, USB itself is not storage. People keep talking about USBs. Oh, I've just put my USB in, can you put the files on it? USB is a communication protocol. It helps transfer the information to put them into some form of flash storage. But flash storage could use other services as well, but USB is quite common. Your USB often is used for your keyboard. That's not a storage device. The mouse, USB mouse, it is not a storage device. So USB is not storage. So we come on to the other thing that USB is within, which is communication devices, and that allows computers to talk to each other or talk to their bits of hardware. Most common ones are things like network cables and modems. Modern modem and network router at the top here with Wi-Fi built in, sending it over the airwaves. Older school, we got this is actually probably a Braille setup by the looks of it for a blind person, but you've got under here a box that takes all the electronic signals and turns them into signals that can be sent over a telephone wire in the noise that you have in that people could talk over as well. That meant that if you couldn't use the computer and this phone at the same time. Gradually they managed to work out a way to increase the bandwidth and have things like ISDN lines that meant you could talk and send data at the same time. But people of my age and right into the 90s, they were used to having to ask, can I go on the internet, because no one could use the phone at the time. If a phone call came in, sometimes it would interrupt you. whilst it shouldn't actually try to ring the phone, just making the connection at the to see if your phone is being used could actually interrupt your connection to your network or to your bulletin board or to AOL or whoever you were talking to. So this is quite an old system, modem, but this is the way a lot of people communicated with their computers, and fairly big companies and universities. They would use a modem to talk to the computer on the other end, and all they had at their end was a keyboard with a screen of some form, or even a printer, and they typed in commands. It got sent over the modem, the computer processed it, sent it back through the modem to talk to this and say, display this on the screen. So there's lots of different communication devices, there's lots of different ways of doing things. To emphasize the USB port, it might be worth, when you do the research, look at what things USB can be used for and how was it done in the past. Okay, so your challenge this week is to first of all find as many different communication devices as you can, and how many different storage devices as you can think of, and then each person writes about a storage device and a communication device. Try and make sure that within your group you're not repeating the work. With communication devices, that might become common. One person does modems, another, and then all of you pile in and help on USB, and guess as much as you can. Okay, so that's your work now. You need to research further what sort of storage devices and communication devices were there. Thanks, guys.